I was delighted to have a chance to take a look at this topic, this thought-provoking topic that we have. I would say from I'm going to say a word about from our own from a Christian standpoint, and then maybe use some practical examples that we've been involved with that show the tension between the two ideas that we had brought to us today. From a Christian standpoint, some of the very same passages that support the respect for respect for the sacred would also support the point of freedom of expression, and that being from the Hebrew Bible, but very much taken to heart within the Christian tradition as well, human beings being created in God's image, and that's points to the dignity of human beings and all of its contradictions and tensions. I think that we also borrow from the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible the relationship between the prophets and the kings of Israel, and that you constantly see this struggle between a kind of prophetic voice on the one hand, which God and the people of Israel and all of us commend, and the truth that the trouble that the truth gets them in. I would say you have from Nathan's sort of telling off of King David to the prophet Jeremiah. You've got all sorts of important words that are being said in opposition to the behavior of the ruling powers that be. And then you also see that that speech, while honored, also has a cost to it. And I think that remains true today, whatever the laws say. This is an important dynamic to remember. Jesus, too, was lived into that prophetic tradition of saying very unpopular things and getting himself in a whole lot of trouble. But those, again, are words that we live by if you are Christian today. I want to also say that in the Episcopal Church and in other denominations of Christianity, you have a baptismal vows that you would take at your baptism or have said on your behalf if you're an infant. And in the Episcopal Church, we promise to strive for justice and peace, and do what we can for the common good. And that's as close as we get to protecting freedom of speech per se. But I think that's something as well to remember. I would say in my work as the director at the Interfaith Center, we've had a lot of very hands-on practical experience of how these two values rub up against one another. And if those of you who remember, in the fall of 2012, if you were a subway rider, you would have noticed perhaps a rather inflammatory ad that said something like, "In the fight between civilized man and the savage, side with the civilized man, up with the state of Israel, down with jihad." A really lovely advertisement that offended, as it was intended to, a lot of people. And this was in response, it was said, put together by the American Freedom Defense Initiative and a woman by the name of Pamela Geller, in response to what they saw as an inflammatory advertisement about aid, about Palestine. And so it was a little bit of a culture war going on the subway ad, going on in the subway. And we worked with Trua and a number of the Methodist women and a whole host of religious and interfaith and nonprofit groups to try to come up with an alternative, to not stand by and let this very disrespectful ad go unnoticed. And took what had happened, because initially the subway had refused to run these advertisements on the grounds that it was offensive. And a court overturned the MTA on its own rulings and said literally, if they had to respect this advertisement, the First Amendment rights of the defense initiative, and could not, they had to show them as long as they did not, in the MTA's view, imminently incite or provoke violence. And since at that point it was hard to show that these ads were imminently provoking any violence, that's a very high bar that some of our European friends or other parts of the country might say we place it too high. But nonetheless, that was a high bar, and it protected those advertisements out there. So we figured, okay, so what are we going to do? How do we respond to this? And we went to the MTA and we said, okay, how about just some big old disclaimers like they did out in San Francisco when the same group was trying to run these ads out there? Let's get a disclaimer and something that says we're going to take this money and send it to the Human Rights Commission that we get for it. And not only that, we're also, groups like Trua, the Methodist Women, ran counter ads that said, in the fight between, what was it, the fight between? Hate and love, choose love. Yes, exactly. So it's sort of something that would be like a play on these really, really awful ones. And sojourners, love our Muslim neighbors, and all sorts of, it was a real boon for the subway, actually. They were raking in the money as people got back and forth. But I think they ended up doing this disclaimer, and in this spring or the winter of 2013, when another set of really just awful ads that had pictures of the Twin Towers being, exploding, and then passages from the Quran next to it, they had disclaimers on them if people had the time to read them. So that goes to what we in this country have always thought, that I wouldn't say we in this country, but many people who argue about the Constitution and what the First Amendment actually means will say that you fight evil speech, like bad speech, with better speech, right? And yes, it's costly. Yes, it's a pain in the neck. Yes, it would be easier if there were, people had better judgment or there were laws that protected it. But any law that's going to protect or, going to force these advertisements off is also going to force some kind of advertisement that you might happen to agree with off as well, because one person's hate speech is easily another person's prophetic message, although we could all argue about that, I'm sure. So I just pose that as this is our New York, kind of one in New York example of how these values rub up against one another. When you take it to a different context, however, a whole nother set of questions comes up. And if you saw, I don't remember if you remember last summer when there was the banned Pussy Riot out in Russia. Did a video on the steps of the cathedral that was, found to be offensive to the Orthodox Church, and Putin, they were put into prison. That was the using of blasphemy laws that were really kind of hijacked by a not very desirable state to put away people who they didn't agree with. And you see that a lot also in not a lot, but you see it occasionally also in Pakistan, where the blasphemy laws are very, can be abused quite easily. And if you remember, there was a girl at about that same time, Rimsha Masi, is that right? Masi, yeah. Who had, possibly had Down syndrome and was being had up for burning pages of the Quran. And that was also a case in which those blasphemy laws that had been in place, I think by a secular government, interestingly, originally put them in as a pretty naked power tool. And you see how they can be abused. So in situations of different types of contexts, we can see that those very efforts to quote unquote protect what is sacred end up deeply abusing the freedom of speech, or even the freedom of religion itself among minorities. So I just want to read in conclusion. There is a UN resolution that the Human Rights Council put together that tried to take on this very difficult issue of anti-defamation, which is the way it's referred to in some contexts. You know, in concern about protecting the sacred on the one hand and freedom of speech on the other. And they kind of came up with, after a lot of wrangling, that many years of back and forth, with the OIC countries introducing this Anti-Defamation League, and then some of the European countries putting in a resolution that seemed quite anti-religious, to see if we could come up with a compromise. And one thing that they said was that after decrying, you know, expresses deep concern, expresses how awful it is, so on and so forth, as these resolutions are wont to do, recognize that open public debate of ideas, as well as interfaith and intercultural dialogue at the local, national, and international level, can be among the best protections against religious tolerance, and can play a positive role in strengthening democracy and combating religious hatred, and convinced that a continuing dialogue on these issues can help overcome existing misperceptions. So in other words, what we're doing tonight is exactly what this document is advising people around the world to do in order to wrestle with these questions. So thank you very much.